All right, let's dive into the archives of early 20th century psychiatry. We're going to deconstruct a really fascinating case, one that presented a profound diagnostic dilemma, a puzzle so perplexing it would take the sharp mind of a young Carl Jung to finally solve it. So, picture this. You have a single patient, a Mrs. Z, who is a practiced swindler. She gets examined by two different teams of medical experts, and their findings lead to two legal recommendations that are polar opposites. One team says she's partially responsible for her crimes. The other says she's totally irresponsible. And that's the big question, right? How is that even possible? The authorities were stumped. They had tons of material on the patient, yet the conclusions were just diametrically opposed. This puzzle eventually landed on the desk of a then-emerging figure in psychology, Dr. Carl Jung. It was up to him to deliver a third, final, and decisive opinion. So let's explore exactly how he untangled this mess. Here's our roadmap. First, we'll dig into the contradictory diagnoses at the heart of the case. Then we'll look at Opinion A, the one arguing for partial responsibility, and Opinion B, which claimed total irresponsibility. After that, we'll unpack Jung's brilliant insight, the social dilemma he saw for asylums, and finally, we'll touch on a new scientific tool he was developing to get at the truth. So let's set the scene. The case revolved around this woman, Mrs. Z, who had a go-to scam. She would repeatedly defraud people using this elaborate and surprisingly consistent story about winning a huge sum in the Hungarian state lottery. The catch? She always needed just a bit more money to pay for her ticket so she could finally collect her winnings. And the whole scheme hinged on a fictitious agent, a man she called August Baumann, who, of course, nobody could ever find. Okay, so let's move on to that first assessment and see how they built their case. The examiners in 1904 were faced with some really complex behavior. Mrs. Z insisted that this Baumann character was real with such stubbornness that they started to wonder if she was suffering from some kind of pathological self-deception. Now, central to both of these opinions was the diagnosis of hysteria. And we have to pause here because what they meant by hysteria back then is totally different from how we think of it today. Influenced by people like Charcot, they saw it as a fundamental, almost congenital part of someone's character. It suggested a kind of constitutional weakness that made people prone to inventing stories and then actually believing them. So the first group, Opinion A, put it all together. They concluded that yes, Mrs. Z was hysterical, and because of that condition, they argued, the normal mental checks and balances that stop most people from lying and cheating just weren't working for her. But, and this is the key part, since they couldn't find any other issues with her intelligence or consciousness, they felt her guilt wasn't completely erased. Their verdict, partial responsibility. But that wasn't the end of it. Just a few months later, after she committed another offense, she was sent for a second, much more thorough examination. This time, the asylum had access to her complete history, and it led them to a far more radical conclusion. This second team confirmed the hysteria diagnosis, but they added another layer. They also labeled her a morally defective psychopath, someone with extreme egotism and a complete lack of moral feeling. And here's the crucial step they took. They argued that her crimes were direct symptoms of her hysteria. She wasn't just a criminal who also happened to be hysterical. They said she was a criminal because she was hysterical. Therefore, she was totally irresponsible, a danger to everyone, and needed to be locked up for good. And there it is. That's the intellectual puzzle that landed squarely on Carl Jung's desk. You have two competent medical teams looking at the exact same patient. Both agree that hysteria is a core part of her condition, yet one says she's partly to blame and the other says she's a complete victim of her illness. How do you possibly resolve that kind of contradiction? This is where Jung's approach is just so brilliant. He didn't choose a side. Instead, he completely reframed the problem. He argued that both opinions had missed a crucial distinction, and once you see it, everything becomes clear. Here we get to the absolute heart of Jung's argument. He says, look, Opinion B was right to spot a moral defect, but they were fundamentally wrong to call it a symptom of hysteria. Now, in an era of big, single diagnoses, this was a revolutionary idea. Jung states flat out that moral defect and hysteria are two separate conditions. You can have one without the other. Mrs. Z just happened to have both. Jung then defines this moral defect, or moral insanity, as its own thing. It's a fundamental, inborn, profound absence of moral feeling. This, he argues, is the real root of her criminality, not the hysteria. The desire to defraud people, the core inclination, stems from her moral defect. And this table just illustrates his argument perfectly. He draws a sharp line between quality and quantity. The moral defect determines the quality of a person's character, in Mrs. Z's case, ruthless and without scruples. Hysteria, on the other hand, only determines the quantity or the intensity of her emotional state. It's just an amplifier, not the source. I love this metaphor because it makes it so clear. If you think of her criminality as a car, her moral defect is the engine. It's what provides the power and sets the direction. Her hysteria, that's just her foot slamming down on the accelerator. It fuels our worst inclinations and makes it impossible for any better ones to take hold, but it isn't steering the car. So with this new, incredibly clear framework in place, Jung could finally deliver a nuanced verdict on the question of Mrs. Z's legal responsibility. Ultimately, he sided with the conclusion of opinion A, partial responsibility, but he got there for a much more sophisticated reason. He argued that her moral defect, the root cause of her crimes, doesn't actually remove legal responsibility under the law. However, her hysteria does limit it. Because hysterics are victims of these intense, momentary emotions, their judgment is compromised. Their will isn't entirely free. But then, after solving the legal question, Jung does something surprising. He steps back and addresses the bigger picture, the entire legal and social system. He starts thinking not just as a diagnostician, but as a physician responsible for a state institution. And he issues this stark, really pragmatic warning. He says, look, if doctors start following the logic of opinion B, if we declare every criminal with a moral defect to be insane and totally irresponsible, we're going to choke our asylums with them. We'd poison the therapeutic environment for the truly mentally ill who need help, and we'd basically turn our hospitals into prisons. The asylum, he argued, must never become an arm of the criminal justice system. So, with the case of Mrs. Z resolved, Jung's work at this time was also pointing toward a future where diagnosis might rely less on subjective interpretation and more on objective experimental science. He was pioneering something he called the psychological diagnosis of facts, using his word association test. The method was actually pretty simple in theory. By measuring how long it took a suspect to react to critical words related to a crime, he believed he could scientifically detect a feeling-toned complex, basically an unconscious emotional knot tied to the event. He saw this as a serious forensic tool, one he'd already used to get a confession out of a young thief, proving its real-world power. So you see, the case of Mrs. Z is way more than just a historical footnote. It's a pivotal moment where psychiatric concepts were sharpened and crucial institutional lines were drawn. And it points toward a future Jung was already imagining, one where the hidden crime complex might one day be revealed by science. And that leaves us with a profound question we're still grappling with today. If the roots of our actions can be scientifically measured, what does that really mean for justice, for guilt, and for free will?